Okay, yeah, Andrew he just asked me to come in just to give a quick presentation on the kind of things we're doing with research in 3D. Perhaps after learning 3D for a few years. Now, I guess in the Faculty of IT, what we do is we do a Foundations of 3D course, which is just as an introduction to 3D. Then we do kind of advanced 3D, where you learn animation, you learn rigging, sometimes particle effects, these kind of things. And then after that, generally you go into, well, it depends on what stream you're doing, but often you have the chance to expand upon your 3D skills in a studio project, which which is where you collaborate with other students, and for up to a year you can put together either an animation or use 3D in games. So I guess what I'm going to talk about very quickly today, it's mostly still images. I have plenty of animations, but I can't really fit them all into this 10 minutes. Up here you've got some very early images of 3D development back from 1972. And this was one of the first 3D animations that was made. What you can see is what they've taken. This is Ed Catmull and Fred Park of the University of Utah. They made a clay model of a human hand, or a kind of a resin model of a human hand, and then they plotted out all the geometry on the surface. And you can see in the image on the right there, they're actually plotting in all that information into a computer using measurements. So, just looking for the next slide here. I'll just go back one. Okay, and this is what they came up with, which, this is 40 years ago, but what's amazing is this is still how we model today. I mean, even these first models are actually quite accurate. I mean, this is how students make hands and faces still to this day. And you can see some of the results. Now, okay, this 40 years ago, this is quite amazing when I uncovered this. And I guess when we talk about animation as well, animation is already a 100-year-old discipline. Here's some images of Gertie the Dinosaur by Winsor McCay, and another animation called The Sinking of the Lusitania. So we have 3D modeling on computers that's already 40 years old, and you have animation that's 100 years old, and there's ways you can argue it's even older than that. Putting these things together today, I've got some quick pictures I took from one of our animations of the civilization of Angkor in Cambodia. What you've got is, well, we just got to discuss just for a second what we do in IT with 3D design and 3D animation and how that feeds into games. I guess if you are in art and design, or perhaps you're an industrial designer, or perhaps you're an architect, you're often using 3D to make things that become real. There's some degree of mission critical here. For instance, I mean, you're designing and prototyping buildings in 3D, and designing industrial designs, things that actually get made into physical objects. Also with engineering, you're testing out simulations in 3D that use real-world physics and might become real-world applications or real-world structures. And today with 3D printing, a lot of the things, if we look around our world today, our manufactured world today, your cars, your phones, a lot of buildings, a lot of this stuff is prototyped in 3D before it becomes reality. So this 3D modeling is really a major force in today's society. The difference is in, I guess, what we do in IT is we're usually using 3D to look into imaginary worlds, to create completely fictional worlds, to use 3D to represent the impossible. One of these things about representing the impossible, I guess, is bringing history to life. And this is one thing I'm interested in. I was an archaeologist before I started with 3D, so one of my main projects has been looking at how to look back at civilizations and put them together, much like you see on a National Geographic channel. This kind of stuff takes an awful amount of research. It's very easy to model this stuff. We could do it in a couple of weeks just to model it. It's not technically difficult, but what takes a lot of time is to check all your facts with the archaeologists, some of them here at Monash and some of them at other universities. Checking whether you've got the architecture right. This is 1,000 years ago. Checking whether it matches the archaeological data. Checking whether it matches some of the excavations the archaeologists have been making. You're putting all this information together in a virtual world, in a very large simulation, And you're running animations and you're testing it with experts. So I guess what I'm saying here is an application of 3D where you are kind of inventing impossible imaginary worlds, but you're using a lot of real world data as well. We don't know exactly what the past looks like. We can only have a fairly good idea. So some of the things we can test out, I guess, I mean, I have hundreds of these animations, but just looking at, large scale visualizations of the city of Angkor and then testing out different kinds of vegetation effects and how settlement would have looked. We're talking about, if anyone's heard of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, we're talking about a civilization that was one of the biggest cities in the world at its time, about 1,000 years ago. Could I get the animation to play, please? Okay, so, I mean, just looking at how we kind of construct this very quickly, we're really looking at landscapes and then trees and then moving figures and animals. And all these things blend together very quickly. So these little animations we're showing here, I guess there's a lot of research here, but really what we're doing is we're getting them ready for game engines later on. We have to get all these facts right before we start building game engines. So all these 3D models are ready for the next stages of research. You probably know very well that in a lot of game companies you have perhaps the animators on one side and the game programmers on the other side. So the two of them work hand in hand. And this is what we're building at the moment with a project like this. It's called the Visualizing Angkor project. This has been going about 5-6 years. We'll probably be running it for quite a long time. Other things we're doing are, we also, one of my interests is this is a marsupial lion skeleton. I did have an animation for this, but I don't think it's going to work here, where you're taking this made by Ben Alexander, one of my ex-students. What he did is he went to a museum and he took photographs of all the bones of the skeleton and then put them together and then reanimated the skeleton and put skin over it as well. So you can look at paleontology through these things as well. Other kind of projects we're doing within Australia is things like remaking a canoe from Torres Strait. Now, this was the largest seagoing vessel in Australia before European settlement, but none of them exist anymore. They only exist in drawings and some paintings and so forth. So before people in a museum actually make a full-scale real model of it, maybe I think it's 30 or 40 feet long, it's best to test these ideas with 3D to see how it can work together and how you can plot it and then you can animate people in it. You can look at the biomechanics and the physics of the canoe in the water and all these other kinds of aspects. All right, landscape modeling. I mean, we do a lot of these landscape models. Now, landscapes for games and movies, as you know, they're kind of, well, often they're just a backdrop, which people realize when they're done badly, but they don't really take much notice of if they're done very well. What we're looking at with landscapes is a lot of simulation tools to try and reconstruct some parts of Australia in which to provide backdrops for these animations and also for biological simulations as well. So the software we're using is Autodesk Maya plus some other software like Vue. Then again, one of our other main projects here is called the Monash Country Lines Archive project. It's a large-scale animation project. What this project is doing, and I'll show you, there's a website up about this where our animations are so far, but we're working with a community up in the Northern Territory, an indigenous community called the Yanyuwa community, who they live just near the sea, kind of in between the Queensland border and Darwin. This is one of the projects we're starting on. I'm working with an anthropologist here at Monash called Dr. John Bradley, and he's been up there for 30 years recording the language of this community, this indigenous community up there. And at the moment, there's only 2 or 3 old ladies left who speak the language, the Yanyuwa language. If you know anything about indigenous Australia, you know that there was actually hundreds of languages here in Australia. A lot of them these languages have become extinct. So in this project here, what we're doing is we're using these stories, you call them songlines, these stories about the land, the Yanyuwa landscape, mythological stories of the Yanyuwa landscape, and we're animating them in language, putting them up on the internet. And what happens is the young kids there can play these animations again and again and again, and then they can learn their language. They can learn these are archiving technologies. So what you're doing is you're saving a language, you're also encoding it, and you're using animation. And the way that these song lines are sung, what happens is as they sing these song lines, they go over the landscape and under the sea and over hills and through round paths. It's a very complex thing. You can only really do this through 3D. You can only visualize it really with 3D. So a lot of these, well, the structures again that we're using, we're making a lot of landscapes, we're making a lot of characters. You can, texture mapping. We're using all these techniques they use for computer games, and for animations and movies. But we're using it in a sense for research in the end, and how these things all come together and mesh together at the end, in how we actually build these worlds. So all these little animals you see here. A lot of these animals end up talking, and some of these fish actually fly through the air. It's in mythology. They can do impossible things, which is exactly what I was talking about before as the nature of 3D for what we do. So this is a lot of these animations. Some of them are still in development, but they're up on this. The Monash Country Lines Archive is a website where you can actually look at all these animations. We've got them up there. I guess to finish up, this is just a brief overview of some of the research we're doing with 3D. With 3D modeling, with animation, and what we will be doing quite soon with game engines, and using games in a sense to look at research, historical research, anthropological research, paleontology, all these kinds of areas. So I guess on a final point, I guess you've got a range of images here in terms of what you've heard of this thing, photorealistic, making 3D models look as real as possible, so you can't tell the difference between what is real and what is computer generated. Well, if you see in the bottom, there's obviously a movie like King Kong does that. The characters have to be so real that they show up next to the actors and it all looks real, even though King Kong is a fantastical being. Then you've got, Assassin's Creed, a very realistic game. And then right back to the beginning, you've got, say, Homer Simpson as an example of a caricature. Not very real, but you kind of move down through the scale of realism to caricature. Where we sit with a lot of our research is about here. Kind of realistic enough, not like a cartoon, but obviously not as realistic as some of the major movies. We don't have to be as realistic as the major movies. It's a blessing in a way, because it just takes ages to make it even more and more realistic. But also, I guess in some of the, what I'm talking about here is the aesthetics of 3D. There's so much possibility in between caricature and realism. And I guess that's where I'd like to finish up. That was just a quick preview of some of the stuff we're doing at Monash for research. My name's Tom Chandler. You can contact me if you're interested in any of this stuff. It's tom.chandler@monash.edu. Thanks very much. Thank you.